Der Präsident.
Meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, einen herzlichen
Ladies and gentlemen, you're very welcome here. The sitting is now open. And we go straight on to the first point on the agenda, a statement by the Vice President of the Commission, the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. She is represented today by the Vice President of the Commission, Mr. STYLIANIDES. You're very welcome here to talk to us about the Turkish military operation in Northeast Syria and its consequences. As you know, we have a new system for catch the eye and blue cards. I don't need to keep reminding you of that. You can either use the traditional form of the blue card or you can use the electronic form. You don't need to wait till the end of the debate to ask to take the floor and to catch the eye. That brings me straight to the debate. Once again, can I welcome the Commission representative, the Council rather. Ms. STYLIANIDES, can you give us the position of Council, please?
Guten Morgen, sehr geehrter Herr
Good morning, President.
Parliament. The Turkish incursion into northeast Syria seems to have slowed down. We acknowledge the contribution made by several international actors to ensure that this is the case. We have seen high-level diplomatic efforts aimed at de-escalating tensions, first by the United States Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo a few days ago, who negotiated a temporary truce with Turkey. We also note the memorandum signed only yesterday between President Putin and President Erdogan in Sochi. The High Representative was in the Parliament with you on the first day of the offence, and she immediately made clear our request that Turkey immediately stopped the attack. Turkey's concerns must be addressed diplomatically, not through a military action that can only further destabilise the region and bring more suffering to the Syrian population. We are also relieved that humanitarian agencies have not had to suspend their response, at least not entirely, and that those displaced from their homes for fear of the fighting have begun to return too. Yet there can be no excuse for the nearly 200 civilian deaths that have occurred, nor for the bombing of hospitals, ambulances and water stations. We care about the fate of Syrian Kurds, and indeed for all the civilians in the zone of hostilities. The only way to address their aspirations and to recognise the sacrifice made by the Syrian democratic forces in the fight against Daesh is to help build a democratic and inclusive Syria, a country that all its citizens can call home. There can be no military solution to the Syrian conflict. It is crucial that instead we support the political process and that a lasting solution is found for all parties involved. Thus, we have to support the work of the Constitutional Committee, due to meet for the first time at the end of the month in Geneva. Despite recent events, or rather, all the more so because of them, the time is right for that committee to meet. We have full confidence in the United Nations Special Envoy Geir Pedersen, and we believe that a step-by-step political solution can be found. Launching the Constitutional Committee can set a positive cycle of trust and confidence and eventually bring about the changes necessary for a peaceful and stable future for Syria. We all know that the path towards a negotiated political transition will not be easy. Yet we must agree with our international partners, and yes, Russia and Turkey too, that changes must be made to the way Syria is governed. We must agree that justice and accountability must be brought for the crimes committed by all sides during the course of that conflict, right up to Idlib and the most recent offensive. And this is for the sake of the peace, stability and reconciliation that we all crave for Syria. Let me turn now to Turkey and its responsibility for the current situation. Turkey's security concerns at its border with Syria will not be answered by the military intervention. This offensive instead undermines the fight against Daesh and threatens our common security. Turkey has made tremendous efforts in hosting several million refugees for many years. There's no doubt about that. Yet, Turkey's military action is only making an already highly complex situation in the region even more difficult to resolve. It only adds to an already complex and dramatic situation. This is why the EU leaders and EU foreign ministers have condemned Turkey's incursion, and this is also why Member States have decided to halt arms export licensing to Turkey. We insist that the incursion must not just be stopped temporarily, but it must cease altogether. The Foreign Affairs Council has also made clear that we will not provide stabilisation or development assistance in areas where the rights of local populations are ignored or violated. The European Union has been clear and united on all this from the very first day of the incursion. We are glad that the Council, the Commission and Parliament have passed the very same messages, and we thank the European Parliament for its continued support to ending the war and supporting a political solution under the United Nations auspices. Thank you, Mr. President.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Commission, Vice President, Mr. STYLIANIDES.
Dear President, dear colleagues, thank you very much for the opportunity to update you on the recent humanitarian development in Northeast Syria. The crisis that unfolded on 9 October has led to civilian casualties, displacement of people, destruction of civilian infrastructure. Heavy fighting took place, including in highly populated areas. There are reports of nearly 200 civilian deaths. At the height of the hostilities, nearly 200,000 people have been displaced. Some have now started going home, but the remaining over 150,000 displaced people come in addition to over 200,000 people that were already in camps and informal sites or hosting arrangements before the crisis. Humanitarian staff were denied safe and unbeaten access to people in need due to shelling and airstrikes or uncertainty regarding territorial control. International NGOs and UN agencies had to evacuate staff to Iraq. Now, let me underline that what the EU President has just said. There can be no excuse for these civilian deaths, damage to civilian infrastructure, absence of protection of people and those who are there to help them. I'm particularly concerned about the horrific situation faced by healthcare providers. Hospitals in Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain are out of services due to heavy bombing and shelling. Kobain Hospital was temporarily out of service because the electricity line and the generators were cut by mortars, and because of shelling, ambulances have been reportedly targeted, preventing the evacuation of patients from the front lines. Medical staff has been killed and even kidnapped. To make matters worse, the emergency is affecting the provision of basic services to a population that was already suffering before the crisis. While the international staff was evacuated, this does not mean that the humanitarian community is no longer assisting the people in need. Life-saving assistance continues to be delivered. We are supporting our humanitarian partners in Northeast Syria with €38 million, and we will continue to support them for as long as is needed. But the fighting must stop, and it remains paramount that international humanitarian law is fully respected and that civilians are protected. Humanitarian workers must be allowed access to those in need. All precautions must be taken to mitigate the risk of harming aid workers, their facilities and assets, including convoys and the people they serve. Humanitarian workers should not be any sort of target. Let me also take this opportunity to recall the EU's line with regards to the return of refugees to Syria. All returns should be safe, voluntary and dignified, and only once the conditions are in place. Otherwise, the European Union will not be in a position to provide support. The same applies to the so-called buffer zones that Turkey is seeking to establish in the north of Syria with a view to eventually sending refugees back. And let me also recall the recent EU 28 statement that any attempt of demographic change will be unacceptable. At the same time, the European Union will not provide stabilisation or development assistance in areas where the rights of local population are ignored. Dear colleagues, the European Commission has recognised and supported the efforts of Turkey to host millions of refugees in its territory. But Turkey's military action in Northeast Syria has aggravated an already dramatic situation on the ground. I'm glad that the European institutions have been united in their reaction against Turkey's military action. But there should be no time for complacency. The broad ceasefire was only partially respected. We must use all our power, all our leverage to stop hostilities, to put an end to this humanitarian tragedy and to allow our assistance to fully resume. And of course, reach in parallel a political solution under the UN. Thank you, President.
Danke, Herr Kommissar.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gahler.